Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
We're joined now by Michelle Bryant, a Democrat from Milwaukee who's running to represent the 6th Senate District. Thank you for joining us, Michelle.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to check about jobs and jobs for the city of Milwaukee, the North Side. I know you had been critical of the Strauss, the meatpacking plant coming to the city. What types of businesses would you like to see in the city on the North Side of Milwaukee? What do you think we should be trying to build there?
So if for just a second, I can just back up, and because the Strauss deal probably became one of the more contentious things that my name has been connected to. And so helping the community to understand it was not about necessarily being opposed to Strauss. It was about the way in which things were done in relationship to the district. I've lived in our district for more than 15 years. The proposal was, 5 to 7 blocks from where I am located. And as someone who works in the legislature as a state, as a staff member for a state senator, I was completely devoid of information about what was going on in terms of what the plant would actually do in our community. And so when I understood that they were potentially going to be killing livestock, upwards to 500 livestock per day in the area, that there were daycare centers and businesses not far. We used to have a meatpacking processing plant down in the Menominee Valley. Anyone that drove through knew what that smell was like, knew some of the problems that went with that. And so without getting a ton of information about what the proposal was, and also the amount of money that we were going to be spending as a city to attract this business in what they were calling an opportunity zone. And what I felt like disingenuous efforts of the city administration to sell this as 250 new jobs coming to Milwaukee, when in fact the plant was simply going to be relocating from Franklin to the area. And so they were bringing roughly 160 employees with them, of which 60% were already said to be city of Milwaukee residents. So that 250 number now drops somewhere to 90. And then if you figured in other employees that didn't work in the plant, we heard that the numbers could be closer to 50. And so for the amount of money that we were spending or what we were going to do by way of tax credits and incentives to bring the company here, the way I've seen the Trump administration misuse opportunity zones, all of those things were issues that I felt the community had a right to vet and to properly discuss and to make sure that we all understood exactly what was going on. Everything was being rushed. Initially, the name of the company wasn't even provided to people. And so that was the reason, and I had some folks say, why would you be against good union paying jobs, Michelle? First of all, there was no guarantee that the company was going to be hiring people from our neighborhood, from our community. So I just think that when you do these things, you look at it from every possible angle, you have as much transparency as possible, and that didn't occur in that situation. So in terms of jobs going forward and what we need, there definitely has to be something in which we are figuring out, everybody has talked about it for years and years, the Rust Belt situation. In terms of manufacturing, we are in a new era. Many of these jobs are not returning. And I think it's disingenuous to try to make people believe a lot of these jobs are returning. So how do we retool our workforce for the jobs of the future? What are we able to do? I had read this interesting segment that talked about new collar jobs and the idea that there would be all of these jobs that are coming in that we haven't even thought about yet, and which industries or which educational institutions were going to be best situated to address those needs. And I was laughing. I was telling someone, I'm in my mid-50s, but we didn't have app developers when I started college in the early 80s. We didn't have social media influencers and folks that worked on these kinds of campaigns. And so there are all kinds of things that we need to do, but we got to be realistic about the fact that we have a state that has roughly about a 25 to 27% college graduation rate. We are not having our workers keep pace with the jobs and the demands of the future. And then one thing that stood out for me in particular with the COVID-19 situation is the number of people who have jobs that they were not able to do from home, that they had to physically be on. And in the African-American community, nationwide, only 18% of African-Americans had a job, in which if COVID-19 were to drag on into the next year, and we saw a situation of businesses opening and reclosing, that only 18% of the African-American community would even be able to consistently go to work and not be put in harm's way. So we have to rethink and pay attention to market trends about where employment for the future lies. And I just don't know that we've done a great job of doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I love that new collar jobs term. I might have to use that. There's been a projection, the governor has warned that tax collections may fall by as much as $2 billion this year. If you're elected, what would you do to try to work to address that shortfall? Would you be focused on cutting spending, raising taxes and fees? How would you try to address the budgetary shortfall that the state will likely be facing?
So I would love to sit here and pretend to have the answer, the magic bullet. The reality is we still have yet to figure out the full impact of COVID-19 on our budget. As you said, whether it is the amount of revenues that typically would have come in, collections from businesses, even, from the local municipalities, we, I think, are still in the dark. I was just we talked about Milwaukee Public Schools reopening, and we know that as a result of the CARES Act, there were $45 to $50 million that would have been put towards education to fill some of those gaps. So we don't know fully what the cost of that will be. And I know NPS predicted a $90 million plan just for that, to reopen our schools safely. So I think the honest answer has to be that we don't know the full impact yet of what we're working with, what the numbers are, and how much we will need for the shortfall. We do have an ability to tap into the rainy day fund for whatever that will be, but I think we could easily deplete that fund given the needs and the challenges that we have in front of us. So there will need to be a real rethinking of priorities, how we fund things, what the way is in which we generate revenue in the in the state's economy. I staffed Senator Taylor on the Joint Committee on Finance for a number of years. So these budgetary conversations, I was one of the staff of the 4 Democrats on the committee around the table having these conversations. So these are not new conversations for me in terms of what do we do, but I've been telling people, and it's been an uncomfortable thing to hear, because the first thing folks say is, how do we grow the economy? How do we move forward? And right now, I got to be honest, I'm trying to figure out how to stabilize it, how to stop the bleeding, how to stop the losses, and then to honestly assess where we are. So for me, right now, I think the bigger, broader picture is, how do we deal with what we have in front of us?
Thank you. From your time at the Capitol, this is a topic that I'm sure you're going to be very familiar with, but district boundaries, redistricting. Yes. The governor has launched his People's Maps Commission to work on drawing that next set of lines. Obviously, the Republicans who control the legislature want to draw this next round. Who do you think should be drawing the next set of district boundaries?
Well, when the governor announced back in January the creation and formation of the People's Commission, it was interesting that he said no legislators, no elected official types could be on the group. And I didn't know how I felt about that, because I do think that there are some things that legislators can bring to the table to help, inform these conversations. Now, whether you're a voting member of that commission is something different, but we know we've often heard the phrase elected officials picking their constituency. We decide who our voters are going to be in terms of folks that work in politics. So I get that part of it. But the idea that you would see legislators who have stood in the way, as Republicans have, from making sure that people were fairly and adequately given voice. The idea that there are carve-outs, if you will. So we will give you this number of seats for African Americans to make their way into the legislature by the way we draw these maps. We will give you this number of seats for Hispanic or Latino communities. Ultimately, we still control and run the board. And then when you look at the numbers, that more people that leaned Democratic voted in the elections, and we still lost the majority of the seats in terms of the state legislature, you just realize it's a rigged game. And so whatever we got to do to make it a fairer process is absolutely something we have to pay attention to. So I agree with the formation of the commission. I agree with lay people having the ability to talk about how these maps should be drawn, the work of these things. I've actually participated in sample district drawing or map drawing activities over the years. And I've been in the room with community folks when they brought maps in, and some of it was computerized. And just to see the faces of our constituents who looked and said, I wondered why when you look at the map, you have these jagged edges and it looks like they reached into another community and snatched a whole block of voters away. And, and people in some cases are dumbfounded that was intended to suppress their vote. And so they are very in tune and engaged now about these maps. So I agree with the process.
In terms of legalizing marijuana, do you support legalizing both medical and recreational marijuana in Wisconsin?
I do. I think that I'm not, and let me be clear, there will be no tapes that I once inhaled or I once, I did this or that. In terms of marijuana use, I do tell a horrific story, though, about a friend having given me something and it had marijuana in it, and I slept for like a day and didn't know what was going on. And I was like, why would anybody do this? But that aside, we know that there have been people, I have a couple of people right now in my family that are fighting different varying forms of cancer, and that this has been the difference. Medical marijuana has been the difference between unbearable, excruciating pain and the ability just to have some degree of a reasonable quality of life and suffering. I know that recreational marijuana has been around since the beginning of time, and all of the things that people have said that could be a panacea of problems if this were allowed to be enacted. We now have states who've taken the leap before us. So there is, documented research available. We can figure this thing out. And the research does not support that it will devastate communities in the way more conservative leaning folks have described. So I think that reasonable amounts of marijuana should be allowed and permissible. And as we talked about, how do we dig ourselves out of our budget shortfall? The folks that just recently trekked across the state border from Wisconsin to Illinois to purchase marijuana and what these sales are doing to bolster their state budgets is going to be crazy. And so why we will continue to ignore this as a revenue stream, truth be told, I think we have to consider it.
Thank you. Wisconsin has some of the highest property taxes in the country. And as a result, school districts and local governments are limited in what they can levy in terms of property taxes. They can obviously pass referendums to exceed those caps. But if you're elected, would you vote to keep those? Do you think those property tax caps should remain in place with the referendum system, or would you vote to eliminate them if you're elected?
I would vote to eliminate them, and before some people jump off the bridge and like, oh my God, what did she just say? So I'm not a native of Wisconsin. I was born in Birmingham, raised a lot of my childhood in New York. And so I've been and my parents have owned property in multiple states. So I've gotten a chance to see how other folks do it. And, I was blown away that people in Wisconsin over the age of 65 or 70 still pay property taxes. Because in a lot of southern states, after you reach a certain age, folks feel like, hey, you've worked hard. We want to make sure you can maintain that home. We know that you are now on a fixed income. And when we talk about issues like gentrification, these young new whippersnappers moving into the district who make all this great money and can do all these improvements to their home. You're on a fixed income. You may not be able to do some of those things, but how do we create a situation where you get to enjoy the home you've worked so hard to pay for over the years? And so I was really surprised that we didn't have anything in place for seniors to be able to help them deal with property taxes. I think Wisconsin's somewhere like number 5 in terms of rankings from highest to lowest in terms of property taxes. So I certainly support looking at what we can do to lower property taxes and how we can and look at different ways that we fund, much needed critical services, because we can't continue to make that one of the primary ways by which we support state services. So whether it's stuff like going back and reviewing wheel tax indexing, or whether we look at sales taxes on, like when we started doing internet and online sales and how we treated those dollars in revenue that came in. We've got to be way more creative in how we fund critical services for the state, and the reliance and the over-reliance on property taxes. And then, when you think about in the African-American community, I think we have 8% home ownership. And so we don't even get to contribute in that way. So how do we do it so it's a system that is more balanced, more fair, and that you don't have homeowners carrying such a heavy load or disproportionate load of how we fund services? So I am very open to tons of discussions around the way we treat property taxes in this state.
Do you think, speaking of taxes, do you think it's time to consider alternative sources of revenues for local governments? For example, to levy like a 0.5-cent local sales tax, or, Milwaukee's obviously been talking about wanting to have more power to have a local sales tax, for example.
So I think there's a broader conversation at play before you even get down to the local level. One of the things that former Milwaukee County Executive Chris Abley, Mayor Tom Barrett, and a lot of local leaders here in the city had talked about was getting our fair share. The idea that we send $1 for every dollar we send to the state, we roughly see a return of 40% coming back into the community. Well, we know that happens because there are communities all over the state, because of the economic situations in those states, that don't adequately generate enough money to support their community. And so you rely heavily on shared revenue. So I think that we have to, as a state, talk about how we're positioned financially, because these conversations continue if we don't grow the economy, if we don't increase jobs, if we don't increase the ability of local municipalities to better take care of their own districts. That being said, when you bring it back to the local situation, of course we should have taxing authority in municipalities. I mean, and it's amazing because when people decided we wanted to put an additional couple of pennies on people's bills to help cover the new stadium being built, that happened. And in fact, they were just trying to figure out what to do with all these couple of millions of dollars that was left over after the law sunset. So local municipalities should have taxing authority and ability. They are best situated to understand what the market will bear in their communities. And, even the way we generate revenue, again, not being from here, when I registered my car in Milwaukee or in the state of Wisconsin, I thought I was going to do cartwheels in the street because this was the lowest vehicle registration fee I had ever seen in my life. In some of the southern states, you register your car according to the value of that car. Now, the sticker shock can be heart-stopping because you can have a $1,400 car vehicle registration bill. But I just think that there are things that we don't do locally that would provide additional revenue that we ought to be much more thoughtful about, and the way we generate dollars.
Would you vote to raise the gas tax to try to find a stable way to pay for roads and highways in Wisconsin?
I would. It's the cost of doing business. I believe in gas tax indexing. Like I said, it was a bipartisan effort that was done years ago. It worked. And I think it became more political in terms of messaging and people trying to create these imaginary, we're holding the line when raising taxes, but we have to be honest. Goods and services are rising. Transportation costs are rising. We have transportation projects we haven't adequately funded and gotten to. And I do believe that we've been passing the buck in terms of bonding and putting, the proverbial credit card that ultimately the balance is going to come due and you got to actually come up with the dollars. So we have to be realistic. The same way we talk about wages should increase, the cost of living increases should be acknowledged. We got to understand that there are additional costs to doing business, and you have to be willing to consider necessary increases in fees and goods and services to be able to meet those costs.
Should the legislature make hospitals a higher priority in the next state budget? Obviously, they've been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic as well, and wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think, once again, looking at what dollars will come through from the CARES Act, the first package, in addition to anything that will happen on the second go around, because that's been the conversation, is that the federal legislators are going to work to shore up some of our infrastructure needs, police, hospital, those kinds of services, because they're going to be hit extremely hard, where they have taken fewer elective surgeries in the course of COVID-19. A lot of resources were funneled and shifted to COVID-19. A lot of dollars that they typically would have made, they haven't. And so we're definitely going to have to do what we can to support these systems because at the end of the day, people talk about banks being too big to fail. You literally can't have your hospital and medical facilities and systems fail. So I think the legislature, we will have to backfill and do our portion that's not met by federal dollars.
Do you think that if there's a business that follows all of the recommended coronavirus prevention practices, do you think they should be immune from lawsuits if they're, like, for example, linked to an outbreak?
I do agree with that. And again, there will be some people who will be aghast, but I have gone to businesses that have been doing everything they humanly can to be responsible business owners. And so everything from the floors being marked and the 6 feet of distancing and employees wearing masks, and you see the workers wiping down things in real time. I've watched that. I've also been in businesses where that's not being done. And you literally are saying, okay, this is a COVID factory, and community spread is waiting to happen here. And so for the businesses, but I think the ambiguity comes in who goes in to define that the business did everything they could, and who can ensure that it was done consistently. Because I came today and you were doing everything that you were supposed to, that doesn't mean that that's what it'll look like next week when those set of eyes aren't there or somebody's paying attention. So I do think that for the folks that are doing everything they can, we got to provide some protections. Otherwise, you are afraid to open your business. We never get the economy up and going. But I think we got to have systems in place to ensure that it's happening consistently, and not just because an inspector or somebody, the health department, did a walkthrough and you were good today.
I think we're just about out of time, but I was just going to try to get in one more quick question, which is when local governments are authorizing public works projects, do you think the bidding standards and requirements should give preference to Wisconsin companies?
I think that anytime we have the opportunity to buy Wisconsin, support Wisconsin labor, to support Wisconsin workers, we absolutely should. It is crazy to me that we would spend money that would build up other communities, other locales, and those dollars not come here. We've asked in previous administrations to understand how much money Wisconsin spends in terms of being a purchaser of services, who those vendors are. And so when you think of things like our driver's licenses being farmed out possibly somewhere else outside of the state, or the different things that we pay for, it's crazy. We need every possible dollar that we can to stay in the state of Wisconsin. So whether it's a public project, government purchasing, We need to do, or state purchasing, we need to do every single thing we can, shore up the workforce, and keep as many dollars in the state as possible when we purchase goods and services and do major projects.
All right. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I know your primary is less than a month away and you're busy, so we do appreciate you talking.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.